Perhaps you have following the latest debates in the European Union about the eastern members of the Union. They say that there is a concentration of power, there is less and less elbow room for civil society, freedom of speech, freedom of media, freedom of the judges are limited. They say that there is an erosion of the rule of law, or there is a weakening of the rule of law. But is that so? I would argue that we pretend that our concepts are universal, but they are not. In my understanding, the rule of law is actually strengthening by the minute. So how is this about the rule of law? Now, the story begins with language, with the map, and with history. So the problem, how we understand the concept of the rule of law is depending on the language what we use. And English is an inadequate language in this sense. So let's try some more precise languages like the Finnish or the German or most of the Eastern European languages, as a matter of fact. So what is the rule of law? What is the law? We have two different kind of meaning for the law. First, if we take the Finnish or the German, we have the so-called Gesetz or laki, which means the legal entity or the individual laws. On the other hand, we had Recht or oikeus, which refers to, on the one hand, to a kind of judicial system, but also to a right to do something, of course, to justice or justice system, but also an entitlement to do something. Now, Rechtsstaat or oikeusvaltio was originally a kind of 19th century notion, which is coming from the German conservative legal thought. It meant originally only that the state has a jurisdiction over its territory. It meant that the state is operated by a legal system and it had the right to rule within its boundaries. Now, its task was to maintain law and order. It never meant a kind of protection of the civil society or citizens of the state or of the abuse of power. Now, why and how this concept, I argue, that actually lingered on over the last 100 years until today. We have to go back in time to understand how and why this conservative rule of law, concentration of power, began. After the First World War, with the disappearance of the great empires, a lot of new, relatively fragile states appeared on the map in the eastern half of the European Union. Now, the experience of these new and relatively fragile states was that they didn't know how long their integrity, their independence would last. So they came up with a new idea of how to protect this fragility. There was this German legal impact on their political thinking. So first and foremost, they thought that only a very strong government can protect the nation, can protect integrity and independence. But what did they mean by a strong government? Well, strength meant, first and foremost, two things: coherence and stability. Coherence meant a kind of continuity of power. That they indicated that, well, a liberal understanding of a governance can be tolerated, but they have to be hindered, or they have to be hindered from taking over the power, to get an access to state power. So they relied on strong governance because they could perhaps protect from foreign influences of these new fragile states. Stability, on the other hand, meant also that you have to play down all pressures that is coming from below, from society. So they downplayed also civic freedoms, and they started to control the judges only to make sure that they wouldn't take the side of the people against state power, against the central political elite. Now, my claim is that after 2 decades, in the in-between period, these countries really lost their independence. First, during the Second World War, and later when the Soviet sphere of influence covered them. So the problem in this sense that also Nazi Germany during the Second World War, but especially the Soviet rule, was a certain kind of model of this conservative understanding of the rule of law, central power. So their experience was, or got ensured and strengthened throughout the 4 decades of Soviet rule. And after the communist regime disappeared, the one thing that they learned very soon in the post-communist transition, that their first steps, the democratization process, was guided by, once again, outside forces, IMF, the World Bank, the EU, the NATO. All they told what to do with the newly reappearing independent statehood. And when finally they actually made it to the European Union, how they understand the European Union is that the old and Western state starts once again telling them what to do and how to do, and when you do it, it's all wrong and there is a criticism. So they have maintained a kind of notion that only strong central governance can maintain any kind of integrity in one union or the other. So they once again remembered this old medicine from the First World War, from the post-First World War, and they apply it all the same. So I started this speech with, is there a kind of weakening of the rule of law? And I try to answer it that no, we have double meaning of the rule of law in this one European Union. We have the liberal understanding, what we share here, a kind of bottom-up democracy. But also we have in the Eastern member states a kind of top-down approach towards power. And why is this a problem? Because these two systems are incompatible with each other. And not only incompatible with each other, but they both believe that they have the right to decide what kind of conceptions they want to maintain. So we end up with a parallel world within this EU, two systems that don't communicate with each other. And this is the problem. Now, how this is related to a very concrete research. I have studied the rule of law, nationalism, and also strategic culture. Well, shorthand for strategic culture is threat conceptions and security conceptions, how these are related to locality or regionality, to spatiality. So the idea was that the space where they located has a definite effect on what kind of rule of law, what kind of nationalism, and what kind of strategic culture they create. What I'm doing at the moment, that how all these actually have a symbiotic and very dynamic relationship with each other. How the rule of law have an effect on what kind of nationalist strategies, nationalist policies can be furthered, and how all these have an influence on what is the threat perceptions and what is security in their mind, and how these threat perceptions and security once again have an impact on the rule of law, the changes in the rule of law. So this is my current research, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Katalin. Very, very interesting. First of all, are you really saying that we're just using kind of the wrong words? Should we just have a really good discussion within the EU about what concepts and words we are using here in the West and then in the East?
Now, obviously, we should have addressed that not only we are using different or the same concept in different meanings, but we overlooked the differences. And the problem at the moment is that these two concepts are actually have a kind of arrogancy towards each other, because both believe that our concept is the real one, the right one, and we are entitled to use whatever concept we have. So I think it is not that easy that we just change the words. We have to rethink that what is our values and how our values are pictured through our concepts. This is, I think, the most important lesson in this.
The rule of law is one of the very founding principles of the EU. Do you feel that the EU has sort of failed in spreading our Western idea of democracy into the East?
Well, I think the EU did everything in order to spread it, but it takes two to tango. So the question is that was there really receivable for this concept? And I would say that because of this long tradition of a very different kind of understanding what is important in society, security is important perhaps than civil society. So the fragility, the common experience of fragility cannot be overlooked when we look at what kind of political systems they are building up. So yes, in a sense, the EU failed, because in the EU, in a sense, ought to fail. And once again, when we are talking about that there is this erosion of the rule of law or a U-turn of democracy, I would ask that when did it happen in the first place? So it was never actually integrated, this kind of Western understanding of the rule of law. Perhaps in a few years they were kind of playing with the concept, but it was not really rooted into these Eastern systems.
Very interesting, very fundamental. One more question. Stability and security. They are good things in a sense, aren't they? But, however, you do see dangers in having a very strong government that some of these countries in Eastern Europe are sort of emphasizing. What are those dangers, and should we be worried?
Now, of course, the danger of strong governance, well, every democracy is striving for strong governance, which means a majority rule. But if you take out the checks and balances from a majority rule type of strong governance, we have a very big problem, because majority rule can turn into a majority dictatorship. It means that a government can rely on a majority, a very simple majority, 50% plus almost one MP enough to get a majority in parliament. And based on this majority, the government can dictate what kind of decisions the parliament should deliver, what kind of new laws the parliament should deliver. So in this sense, majority rule can empty out the whole parliament building, the whole parliament concept. And of course, a majority rule taking further, like in Poland or in Hungary, where they say that the majority is about the people, the people's will. So they start to control also the judges, because the people should have a kind of say what the judges are doing in their closed chambers. So majority rule without checks and balances. Checks and balances is about how you deal with the minority. What kind of rights the minority is protected with, how you deal with minority issues in the parliament or in society. So minority is always a litmus paper. How you deal with minorities is a litmus paper of what kind of strong governance you have.
Good points. But let's give a round of applause to Katalin Miklossy.
Thank you.